Hey Rachel,
Good morning, Brad.
good morning. Thank you for joining me. We were just chatting a little bit, and now we will dive in to our conversation, which we have intended to be an exploration of gender and sex and sort of the cultural situation that we're in right now and how people are thinking about and understanding and exploring this really complex topic. Um, Rachel and I have been in communication somewhat, mostly through email, and we've connected mostly through the work of some psychologists that we're both really interested in. So I think primarily we connected through the work of Greg Henriquez, who is a really important and wonderful psychologist and professor of psychology and meta theorist. Rachel's also been exploring pretty deeply the work of John Vervaeke, who's another psychologist and someone I'm also really familiar with. So we're just really two people who have been on a journey of learning and exploration, largely really thinking about psychology and thinking about this issue of gender and trying to really bring the care and thoughtfulness that this really complex topic deserves. Rachel, I'll say a little bit about myself, and then I'll give you a chance to share a little bit about yourself, and then
Sure.
we'll dive in. As you know, I'm an educator. I'm a school leader. I got my doctorate in education, and I've been studying psychology and education for a long time. And as a school leader, the issue of gender and sexuality is just something that I've really come to care deeply about, not just as an expression of my own just curiosity and interest in wanting to understand things, but also I feel like I have a sense of responsibility to help children and families and teachers make sense both of understanding the complex topic of gender and also to understand what's going on in the world and how do we situate ourselves in a really polarized sort of cultural milieu that we're in, and how do we hold a conversation like this. So I guess part of my intention is to explore the topic, to learn from you and sort of share our learning together with others, and also to kind of model like how can people think and talk about this topic in a productive way. So thank you, Rachel, for joining me. I'm really excited to get to know you better. I've heard you talk a few times on podcasts and videos, and we've been in touch by email. But this is the first time we're talking. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brad. This is really nice getting to know you and just talk over these issues and talk with people like yourself who are interested in handling them with care and also looking at the context of the wider culture, including the cultural battles that are unfolding and also ways that we can find deeper meaning, deeper, identity in the world, as a individual, as a group, that kind of thing. You know, I do not come from an academic background, pretty much whatsoever. I think I mentioned on one of my videos with Greg that I dropped out of school, like college, almost immediately. I had a big scholarship. I rejected that. I can't stand academia, like for some reason, it just wasn't for me. So I kind of ignored philosophy and, to an extent, psychology, et cetera, except as like a layperson for a long time, until encountering John Vervaeke's work, at which point I was suddenly like smitten completely with philosophy, not just as an academic pursuit, of course, but as like a way of life, as John presents it, and tied in with cognitive science and psychology, but also mythology, religion, symbolism, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of that for me, circled around the issue of aspiration, as per philosopher Agnes Callard, who John talked about quite a bit in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis video series. Um, and it so happened that at the same time I was watching John's big series, 50 hours of philosophy and cog sci videos, um, I was considering gender transition. I was kind of going through this whole questioning, who am I? What am I doing? What's going on with my gender? How do I present my gender? How does it relate to the rest of me? How do I relate to the world? All these questions that come up through the haze of pain that is known clinically as gender dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And so I think the confluence of those two events was really important for me because I was going through my own process of identity, existential crisis, long dark night of the soul kind of shit. Can I swear
Mhm.
on this? I'm sorry.
It's fine, but I guess we'll try not to in general.
I will try not to. I'm sorry. I should have asked. Um, it's my default.
Awesome.
um, and then also coming across John's work and suddenly realizing that there was, not only a general application of his work to my life and the life of people I knew, but an application to my exploration of gender as well. And it sort of threw me into aporia, as John would call it, the pathless land of questioning with no answer, this deep sense of wonderment that is almost like it just stops you in your tracks. Um, because I was like, I went from what is my gender to what, as I phrase it, what even is gender? Like, I realized that I didn't know what it was. I didn't know anyone who knew what it was. And then I began to realize what I still think, which is that we never knew what it was as a culture. We had this hole, we had this like understanding in the modern world, maybe gender equates to sex, etc. And then more recently, in what gets loosely termed as postmodernism, we kind of threw out any universal ideas and have an incredibly relative understanding of gender.
Mhm.
None of that was satisfactory to me. And so I embarked on this real journey in myself of questioning and wondering without knowing, um, to sort of remake a version of myself that was more suited to the world based on, maybe my inner proclivities, my inner biological makeup in some ways. Um, but that was a journey like any, in some ways like any other philosophical or spiritual journey where you're growing into the person that you have the potential to become. I felt this deep-seated sense of having a female soul inside me,
Mhm.
um, at my core, but I didn't feel like I could relate to the term woman. Like that didn't feel right to me to claim that term or to, wear that suit, so to speak. So that was really the seed of this whole process in trying to understand gender as, as it exists in culture and cross-culturally and in primates, et cetera. Just coming from my own experience and working with what I found, and dissatisfaction with the culture at large. So now I'm kind of looking at it with other people and
Yeah.
people like you and John and Greg and Adriana Forte-Niali, and just talking about different aspects of it, what it is, what it can be,
Mhm.
what it ought to be in some ways, and really gently looking at new ways forward through that morass that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. And what I love about your story is that it is this process of self-discovery and self-actualization, right? And I feel like what we want as an educator, as a parent, what we want for all people, what we want for children and everyone is to be on a journey of self-discovery and self-actualization and to be open-minded and to be learning as much as possible and integrating as much as possible on that journey for the sake of wholeness and health and happiness and overall human growth and your own development. So it's beautiful to see that that journey has led you to approaching the issue in a certain way and sort of learning what you have. So I'd love to share. I'd love for us to just for the sake of helping others, like what are some of the key things that you feel like you've learned on this journey of inquiry and in particular, I'm thinking part of our framing is really trying to establish something like an integrated or integral understanding of
Mm.
gender. So we're thinking about biology, we're thinking about sex, we're thinking about genetics and neurobiology, we're thinking about culture, we're thinking about psychology, right? We're thinking about the influence of society and technology. So all of that is ultimately included in our reality.
Yes.
And what are some of the key things that you have felt like have helped you understand what gender is and understand sort of yourself in that process?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great framing because I really found in myself in that kind of search for some kind of understanding, I had to really let go of reductionist ideas of gender in any sense. Oftentimes, you hear about, biological essentialism or something like that, and that's usually a critical term. But also there's, cultural essentialism, and saying that gender is just a cultural construct, or gender is just something that I sort of project out of my, like sub-rational self and onto the world. I just make this thing and I have it now. That's a form of essentialism as well that I've seen. So what I really had to do was look at all of these ideas. John would call them folk epistemologies of gender, ways of knowing what gender is, just kind of as a culture. And accept as much as possible the truth in all of them, and also see that they were the proverbial parts of the elephant. That they all had some truth to them, and a lot of times way more depth and knowledge than I myself have. Like when people talk about gender as a cultural construct, they can go back hundreds of years cross-culturally and explain and explore how gender exists on that level. But it doesn't explore the other aspects of gender, which I found essential to my own journey. I felt like that it didn't give me enough wisdom personally to enact my own gender transition, just to think of gender that way, because I was like, well, if gender, for instance, if gender is just a cultural construct, why would I transition? It didn't really make any sense to me that I would have this deep-seated need for it, this painful inner longing and sense of identity, when it's like just something like, a different form of currency or something like that, right?
Yeah.
What I did was pull back from all that and look at the whole milieu and realize that all of these answers were not even wrong, so to speak. They were so limited in their scope that they couldn't even begin to address the question properly, which is where John and Greg's work came in so handy to me. So I could really briefly cover some of the layers, if that sounds good.
Sure. Yeah.
Jump in. Looking at gender from a purely, reproductive biological sense, I think you can't really eliminate that level, because, when we come to our nearest neighbors, the primates, we see, all of these different primate species as children imitating the adults in their group, and typically imitating the adults with the same sexual parts, right? Like that's the norm for other primates to do. That seems to be the norm for humans across cultures. There's something there where we're looking at sex as the core of gender. And sex also gives us something sort of which to build gender from in our species. If we look at like, okay, now we're a more sophisticated creature, we have new capabilities, we have this whole mindset, we can talk to each other and build cultures. But that can rely on like lower forms of development, so to speak, from the animal world and even the plant world. So that's the sexual level, kind of in a really brief version.
Yeah.
And then moving up to our mindedness as animals, as primates, we have this sense of needing to behave in certain ways as an animal to move ourselves around in the world, right? And to find food, avoid predators, that kind of thing. As primates, we need to, of course, include the social dimension very strongly in the way that we behave. So primates have this sophisticated, and you probably know more about this than me, but sophisticated interpersonal, set of relationships, and they're always kind of figuring out how they belong in their group and who they have power over and who they're friends with and who, appreciates them and that kind of thing. So I think that gender, when you're looking at like a child, whether it be a primate or, specifically a human, I don't think you can eliminate the learning that goes into gender. And this is like a big part of, the way I've been thinking lately, because these chimpanzees, these orangutans don't just have a gender, they don't just get born and they have a sex and therefore they have a gender. They have a sex, and then they like often rely on, watching those examples of individuals with their same sex to develop into an adult version of themselves. And so, depending on what those adults are doing, like sometimes the females in a pod of like gorillas will be eating a certain plant, and then like the female young will eat that specific plant, even though there's tons of other plants available, right? They're just kind of aping the culture, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah.
Um, so that doesn't seem innate in the biological sense to me. It seems innate in the sense of being an animal that is learning and developing. So we have this whole mindedness
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, Greg Enriquez likes to say, that we need to take into account. And I think that is where gender often really starts to shine on the human level, as opposed to like a simple, you know, even like a plant or something, even where it's just sexual reproduction, or, you know, a simple animal where it starts to, you know, kind of follow that line toward the primate, and suddenly exploding into all these different types of behaviors. As a
Mm-hmm.
human, you know, I have a very complicated brain. Clearly, you know, we have very complex nervous systems that have come out of the primate world. And in terms of like the studies so far, the research that has been done on that level of our, you know, embodied reality, um, the consensus seems to be pointing toward gender as rooted in neurobiological reality.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, most individuals in our species and other primates will have, you know, brain type A that matches body parts A,
Mm-hmm.
and brain type B, body part B. And a
Mm-hmm.
few of us will have something different. We'll have brain type A, body type B, or maybe the brain will be like somewhere kind of in between. So
Mm-hmm.
there's, you know, a little more flexibility on the neural level than there is on the physical level. I mean, we could get into like the exceptions on the purely like sexual reproductive level, where there are people who are
Mm-hmm.
intersex or have other situations that are atypical. But by and large, I think, you know, sex tends to be more binary than gender does. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think bimodal tends to be a term used for gender that I like a lot, where it's just kind of like on the average, there's like a couple of bell curves here for the
Yeah.
two genders, and then in between there's some area that's a
Yeah.
little murky, but it's not like a flat spectrum like, you know, you'd see in something like the gender bread person or something like
Yeah.
that. The
Exactly.
examples
Yeah.
out there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we have to kind of look at that as a little more on a more sophisticated level to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the research that indicates that, you know, that I would like to say, you know, trans people are actually who we say we are, you know, includes MRI studies, cadaver studies, dissections, autopsies, looking at primates, you know, as an example, where you see primates who are behaving in a way very similar to transgender humans. You know, the fact that a fair amount of transgender people do exhibit some kind of behavior in early childhood that would say like, okay, there's something going on here. That's a sticky issue, which I'm sure we'll get into more. Um, but you know, something that is that early onset, so to speak, seems to me to indicate, you know, a biological basis. Um, the fact that trans people are more often left-handed or ambidextrous, the fact that, you know, sexually queer people are also more left-handed, ambidextrous, and there seems to be a pretty strong neurobiological basis for sexuality at this point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the fact that many of us who are gender, you know, gender atypical also are sexually atypical as
Mm-hmm.
well, you know, and have other differences in our brain structures besides, you know, being left-handed and that kind of thing. All seems to point to a pretty strong case. And I could go on with like genetics and like second to fourth finger digit ratios and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
I don't want to
Yeah.
get into the weeds too much on it.
Yeah. That is a great initial framing. Yeah, and I just feel it's really it's so affirming because I feel like you and I are people who have just independently done some research on this topic and have tried to delve into it in search for understanding. And we've just landed in a very, very similar place where so much of what you've said mirrors the way that I've also been thinking about it. Because I've just been trying to follow the research and reality and trying to think ontologically, like what is the reality here? And it's just some of the things that you named, I just want to reiterate because they're so important, even though they're so kind of simple and common sense, you know, the discourse in our society is losing sight of common sense in a lot of ways, you know? So just needing to integrate the biological, you know, affirming that there's a ton of evidence for a neurobiological relationship, but then still differentiating gender from sex and showing how culture and imitation and the behavior patterns of whatever your culture are from primates to humans is an influence. And it's, you can't reduce gender to sex, but nor can you erase sex or biology. And it's just having, you know, developing that more sophisticated, nuanced, complex view on, okay, how do we hold these truths together and leave space for emergence, leave space for, like you said, acknowledging bimodal reality. And I think that's a really important concept to unpack a little bit. You know, partly what I hear in the sort of discourse space is a sort of really simple refutation or denial of binaries, right? Like, oh, it's not binary, and it's just a spectrum, and it's just a social construction, sort of like you said. But those kinds of oversimplifications are not any more helpful than the oversimplification of reducing everything to biology. We really have to do better than that. We have to hold both. And we have to be able to say that there are clear patterns. And another thing that we talked about in our email was thinking historically and cross-culturally is really important too, right? Because a lot of the conversation can get caught up in, oh, well, that's just what, you know, Western society thinks or Europeans think, or it's like, you know, as though other cultures think totally differently and don't conform to bimodal gender norms. But actually, if you look historically and cross-culturally, just with an open mind and really try to do the research, you see many patterns. You see bimodal patterns, right, across the globe. You see that there are really well-established gender norms, and many cultures, as you shared some resources with me about, many cultures have more than two categories, right? There are multiple ways of embodying and inhabiting a unique combination of sexuality and gender in any given culture. But that doesn't take away the fact that in those cultures also, there are still very clear bimodal norms, and you will have very clear gender norms for men and for women, and you may have 3 or 4 other categories, because not everyone is exactly the same, and we don't have to be homogenous and literally binary as though there's only 2 choices. But those things somehow get conflated so easily when actually it's all true. Like, all of those things are true. Bimodal patterns are so clear, they're so clearly related to sex and genetics, and especially neurobiology, which I think is what you're learning a lot about. And every culture can find ways to make space for a 3rd category or a 4th category or a 5th category, and not just because individuals are just choosing to create new categories, but actually, as you've discovered in your research, there's something really real going on with various people, such as yourself, that it's very deep. It's not just something that you just woke up one day and said, oh, I want to be a woman. It's much more deeper than that. And it's part of, too, we have to integrate what we learned from sort of the gay rights movement, right? Of like part of affirming gay rights and just the reality of homosexuality is realizing that, no, this is real. People are just gay. They always have been. They always will be. It's not just something they're choosing. The idea of conversion or changing their mind is absurd and misguided. And I would say it's probably very similar for these other categories like transgender, right? There's something very real there for particular people. And our cultural question, our educational question, right, is how do we include that? How do we understand and include and love and honor that diversity without saying and thinking things that don't make any sense? Like, oh, well, it's all just a social construction, right?
Yeah. If you get, if you get too carried away with that, I get a little fired up about it, but you get into these weird contradictions where people are like, it's all just a social construct, gender doesn't matter, it's all fluid, and, but also you need to like be extremely diligent about honoring people's pronouns and gender identities at the same time. Like those two things can't fit together. That's a really strong contradiction, And so, that kind of ideological mess that we get into, I think results from detaching the cultural level from the pure like life biological level and the animal level of our identities. If you don't think of gender as a social construct at all, you get into trouble. And if you think about gender as only a social construct, you get into trouble, and people will say like, well, clothing doesn't have gender. And I'm like, well, it's really like more complicated than that because, it does have gender in certain ways in certain cultures, and that changes from culture to culture, yes, but that has an influence on the mind of the people in those cultures, and it has an influence in the way we organize ourselves and that kind of thing. So, like to say yes or no to those kind of questions is, to me, it has become like sort of just based on wrong presuppositions about modeling gender accurately.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like even just from what you've said so far, we have a basic model, like we have a basic picture of these are some of the different components. This is how they fit together. There is space for all of these truths to sort of be integrated. Um, which I guess leads me to sort of, I guess the next step in the conversation for me is just thinking about what's going on in our culture and our society that's making what we've said in 20 minutes or so, which it seems like pretty straightforward for anyone who's just doing some reading and research and thinking about it, say, oh, okay, this is how some of these things fit together. And yet somehow it's so hard, it seems to be so hard for people to have this conversation and to not get polarized, to not get political, to not get really ideological, to not get offended and maybe even mean in a conversation like this.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's something that you've thought about or have thoughts about, and I want to help. So maybe just start there, and then another reflection we can maybe ponder is just thinking particularly about children and sort of how would we help young people on their journey of self-discovery, going through puberty, which is not easy for anyone. Like
Mhm.
what would be some maybe pointers for helping people? But I don't know if the sort of cultural polarization is anything that you thought about as well.
Definitely, yeah, because I'm always, in the political football. Like I'm always the football in the football game. So whether it's, my team or the other team
Yeah,
or the third team,
yeah,
it keeps coming up in these ways around me. And I definitely don't claim to have any kind of complete understanding as to why it's happening. I think that the framing, of like a purely social justice version of gender can be a real problem. And I think actually a lot of us are discovering that to be the case, or at least some of us are
mhm,
realizing that, if we want gender as a reality from which we can grow and we can use to grow in ourselves, we can't just have this like this, a view of opposition to what has come before. We need to actually be looking at being able to build with others a new culture. So that's one thing I think is happening, just like framing this only as a social justice issue specifically. The fact that we tend to be grouping off so much in our culture, we don't, I see this in the kids I work with. I work with a lot of queer youth or questioning youth, and I really try to help them tease apart who they are
mhm,
rather than, push in one direction or another. But they seem to be really honed in on the group identity level of their
mhm,
existence, and they don't like the universal humanity is kind of lost, and then their individual self is kind of lost in that, right? So they're like both missing themselves and missing like the wider connection with people. And it seems like we have to know what group we're in before we can even, that's more important than relating as just plain old human beings on the earth, as ourselves. I think that's another issue. I think there's a regressive, wanting to be back how things were back when things were simpler and just there were just the two genders and that's how things are and should be, and like there's obviously
yeah, yeah,
tendency toward that. I probably shouldn't call them regressive, but there's a wistful, wanting to return to that for sure. And again, like all these sides have some truth to them. So it gets so
yeah,
complicated. So those are a few. There's
yeah.
probably a bunch more floating around in the back of my mind, but yeah.
Yeah, no, so important and helpful. I just want to honor again, just reiterating and honoring the underlying partial truths of part of what's happening. Like I want so much to honor the good intentions of people who are concerned about social justice and equity and equality. But yet somehow we have to make the sort of educational move to help people understand the implications of oversimplifications, right? And like the actual consequences of reducing gender to a social construct, and how that's not the fullness of reality. And when we make that kind of oversimplification, there are really negative consequences, and we're just not honoring the truth. And if we hold that position in an ideological way, we're actually putting ourselves in conflict with people who are holding other aspects of the truth, right?
Yes.
And for those, and for other people who are more holding maybe the side of like, no, I know that there is a biological, basis to sex and gender, and they're holding that side. And if they're just othered as that regressive, conservative, whatever supremacist person, that badness, then that's how we get the polarization. And we have to, and I don't think it's that hard, at least it doesn't feel that hard, to really bring these things together if we can just open up better kinds of conversation spaces.
Yeah. I think, that's like the key to me. John Vervaeke calls, dialogos, the emergent wisdom and collective sort of rationality that can come out of opening up the conversation space as like us two people hanging out, and good faith, and trying to apply our rationality as well, I think that's important.
It's possible. And there's also space for, we have to find a way just culturally to acknowledge, I mean, I guess this is kind of a separate topic, but just to acknowledge the voices and the insights of people who have done the work, so to speak, like who've actually done the research and who actually have things to refer to and who actually have really thought about it and brought and have some things to share. It's like when to listen and when to speak, like I'm interested in learning from you because I know that you've done a lot of thinking and work and you've had your own experience about this. And we're finding that we've done a lot of, I've also done some work on this, and that's why I think we're resonating so much. And there are many situations in which maybe people haven't read all the research that we have, and they haven't been through the experiences that you've had. And how do we help them just not have to and the other point you made was the sort of neo-tribalism is one way of thinking about it, or these sort of, or mimetic tribalism, where there's such a strong cultural push right now to sort of claim your group and have this group identity. And we're so oriented that way that we're actually not oriented toward listening and learning from others if they're not part of our group, right? And we have to find a way to break that down, like you said, and just have a better, and partly that too, it's like we can see the partial truth and need there. We need that sort of tribal layer of our identity. We need that group identity to some extent. But what we need, I think, is a healthier integration between the individual, the group, and then humanity, right? Like and just to have some really simple, like how simple is that? Like it's a very simple framework, like you're an individual and you're a part of groups and we have a common humanity. And if we could just simply relax into that sort of interpenetrating sense of self, we'll all just be so much better off.
It feels relaxing physically to me, just to hear it, I'm just like, oh yes, exhale.
Because we're also multidimensional, and we have to integrate those different parts of ourselves and honor those different aspects of others, right? Like you have an experience that is really unique to you and that is somewhat similar to other people. And you're also just a person, like the same as me and everybody else. And all those things can be true. Thank you. I just love, it's really easy for me to just reflect back what you're saying, because it really is so aligned with my own thinking and feeling. And one thing we haven't talked about or communicated about is your work with youth as well. So we both work with young people in different ways. So I'd love to hear too about things that you've learned in working with young people and things that you have found helpful, with part of our intention here being, how do we help parents and educators and potentially young people
Mhm.
to, understand and think about how to go about this journey of self-discovery and understanding sexuality and gender.
Yeah, that's great. Love to dig into that more because it's something I struggle with on a daily basis with the kids I work with.
Yeah.
Many of whom are also dealing with, psychosis as it's termed medically,
Mhm.
or, depression, anxiety, bipolar, et cetera, like all kinds of diagnoses and poverty, abuse, trauma, obviously the root of a lot of the mental health issues that I work with. So I'm seeing like really complex situations, really, really difficult life situations, and gender and sexual identity is thrown into the mix of those.
Mhm.
Um, I think because of that, and because of the work of, especially John Vervaeke in this case, I see like just a general need for reclaiming a meaningful culture connection. I think that's part of that identity problem, that the group identity problem, is we're trying to find connection through that labeling, like really strict labeling system of ourselves. A lot of my kids really want to do that at certain stages or other. They just like are very obsessed with labels, as I was at one point.
Mhm.
Um, and I try to help them not discourage it, but you know, again, hold it, like take it seriously, but not literally, maybe just kind of like keep on the quest with it. Like you can have a label like gender fluid or something, and you can stay with it and like see if it, and does it help you, asking, kids like, how is this helping, how is it hurting, what is it, what else might be a good fit for you, that kind of thing. Just the questioning process I think is really useful as like a mentor. I really try to stay like, wait, even if I think this kid's probably going to transition, or this kid is probably not trans and they're trying to sort, what I mean? I just try to
Mhm.
obviously like keep my strong opinions out of it, but also, like be realistic and see like, okay, where are they coming from? What do they even, if they say they're trans, like, what does that mean to them? And like, in their own words, like, what is that to them? Instead of just saying, well, it's gender identity, it's this, and then, having them, spit back to me something that they heard on TikTok. I want to, that's okay, but I want
Yeah.
to get underneath that and
Yeah.
see what is their understanding. So that's a lot of what I'm doing with kids these days, is trying to open, like, kind of, you know, in a Socratic way, start to like mutually question the topic of gender as we're talking about our own lives and our own experiences, so that we
Mhm.
can come to some deeper understanding. I want to throw this in before I forget about it. It's a little bit
Mhm.
off the side, but the need for, what I perceive as a need for rituals of adulthood,
Mhm.
and other rituals for, not, for cis people, like, that
Mhm.
have vanished. Like I think of like teenage boys, and that was sort of me back in the day when I hung out with, cis teenage boys. And boy, we did a lot of dangerous stuff because I think we were looking for something to prove our adulthood, manhood in that case. Specifically. So that's getting off to the side, but I feel like kids kind of
Yeah.
need this grounding and connection, community, family, and like this kind of ritual aspirational possibility for them to grow into who, like, deep down they might feel like they can become, ideally. So all
Mhm.
ideas there, just kind of a mishmash of a stew of thoughts for you.
Yeah, no, which all of which I agree with so much, and it's encouraging to hear the way that you're approaching working with young people. I think that's what's needed, and that's what we need more of. Is again, just we need to hold space for young people um to figure these things out without being overly pressured or pushed down certain paths.
Yes.
And I totally agree with what you said about rituals too. And it's another thing, again, if we step back and think historically and cross culturally, this is something that is very, very common pattern in human societies, is to have coming of age rituals that are gendered, right? And again, it doesn't mean that in those cultures there's only two, but
Yeah.
there are going to be bimodal patterns and there's going to be rituals. And it's actually partly, I would think, this isn't something I would have researched specifically, but by the time you go through a sort of gendered ritual, um, I would think that that would be part of the journey of discovery, of kind of figuring out, like, by that point, are are you part of that sort of gender construct in that culture or not, right? And that could actually be in service of helping an individual figure out where they are on the spectrum, or if they're going to fit that sort of gender norm in that culture, right? By going through some sort of process. So yeah,
Yeah,
we have so much work to do there. And in our culture, and this sort of Western, just thinking about America at this point,
yeah,
we've lost a really coherent sense of the possibility space and way to hold inclusion for third and fourth and fifth categories, right? And we've also lost the ritualization of even just the bimodal patterns of masculinity and femininity. And I think all these things are really having their impact on us in myriad ways, and are part of sort of this postmodern milieu that we're in, where there's just a lot of confusion, frankly. And part of my concern is, like what you just described of how to appropriately work with a young person and not push them one way or the other. Part of my concern is, it seems like, as I'm reading about what's going on in the world, it seems like there are things that are happening that are not super healthy. And that partly because of the push toward group identity, partly because of social media, like you mentioned, TikTok, like there are definitely, some people have seen correlations between social media exposure and then gender dysphoria in some form or another. And also, what you said about too, it's really important that you surface that, in the young people that you're seeing, there's a wide range of what's going on with them psychologically and emotionally. And a lot of some of the discourse around transgender and gender dysphoria, it's been linked with mental health, but in ways that are also still too oversimplified. Like basically, there's been a really strong push for really sort of quickening the pace at which we sort of allow young people to make really big choices about hormones or surgeries in the name of supporting their mental health, right? Because we're worried that if we don't, it's going to have negative consequences, and they'll be more likely for suicide and things. But if you really look at the research on these things, that picture has been greatly oversimplified in a lot of these narratives. And really what you see is more like what you're dealing with, is young people who have all unique constellations of really complex psychopathology and emotional issues, and untangling that and helping them process that in a therapeutic environment is really, really so important, and not going too fast to, oh, well, the problem is that you need to transition, and if you transition, everything will be better for you. And there's definitely lots of data right now that lots and lots of people are realizing that wasn't the answer for them, and they were sort of pushed in that direction too quick. They thought it would solve their problems. It didn't, because what's going on with them psychologically and emotionally is much more complex than that. And what they really needed was a more psychology-oriented, therapeutic space to sort of work out what's going on for them as a unique individual, not just as someone who, by claiming a different group identity, will somehow be healthier and happier.
Yes. And imagine if then there were these like rituals and cultural celebrations of the bimodal identities as well, so that if people, wanted to, there wouldn't be that much pressure from the outside culture, right? For kids to be like, well, I can't be anyone unless I'm queer. I'm not special. I'm just boring and ordinary. And I'm an oppressive imperialist colonial mindset. You know what I mean? Like we get into lots and lots of terms, again, all of which have, there's validity here and, at different levels of different things. But, that combined with that caring presence of like a mentoring person, someone perceived as wise and caring, and with cognitive flexibility in ourselves to be able to like interact with this person without any preset notions of who they are and who they can be. Like, isn't that what we all want, sort of?
Yeah. It's certainly what I want for everyone. Yeah, and for the children that I'm working with. And it's so, I just appreciate that we can both acknowledge that. And I think you're right that there's a relationship between healthy and affirmed sort of bimodal gender norms. And like, it's almost like the more healthy we can be in our bimodal gender norms, the more healthy and open we can be to include any individual who doesn't fit those gender norms, right? And I think there's a relationship there that hasn't really been explored. It's like, and if we're perpetually critiquing and deconstructing and devaluing what it means to have healthy masculinity and healthy femininity, it's going to actually sort of create lack of clarity around when an individual isn't fitting that mode and actually needs to be like, how do we make healthy space for people who don't fit those categories? If they're not even healthily defined in the first place, then it just starts to feel like maybe we are just all genderbread people and we just get to choose what we're doing. It's like the default is just confusion.
Yeah, at which point then, of course, why would you have to respect someone's identity if it's just this random choice that, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
again,
exactly.
there's so much contradiction there,
Yeah,
problems, and I feel always the need to be like, yes, and also a lot of actually trans, trans and queer kids get oppressed, get kicked out of their houses, et cetera. That
yeah,
can be hard for them too. And like you said, if we have a healthier I think understanding of gender all around, we could get
yeah,
into something where it's like we're benefiting each other, like us atypical people, like, with like even like with autism or something like that, similar, like we can benefit society by having this unique minority perspective.
yeah,
It doesn't mean there needs to be a ton of us,
yeah,
but then, the society also can benefit us. So we could have a really great
yeah,
reciprocal opening, as John
yeah.
Vervaeke calls it, where we're both mutually unfolding.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. My sense is that the better we understand reality, the more thoughtfully and carefully we can include all of it, right? And everyone. And it's like if we have fundamental confusion, like we're going to also be confused in how we respond to people and how we include and honor people, right? So just like having, one thing that came up in the last conversation with you that I listened to was having rigor without rigidity. And
Yeah.
also what I would add to that is clarity with compassion, right? Like the more clarity we can have on these issues, the more we're actually able to have compassion because we understand what we're working with and what we're talking about. And if it's fuzzy and if it's oversimplified and if there's a lot of reductionism happening, then we just don't have the clarity that we need to have the compassion that we want. And then that's really what I want so bad for, especially those who are more oriented toward social justice and wanting to be inclusive and wanting to be sensitive about language and pronouns. We need all of us to bring a little bit more rigor and a little bit more clarity and a little bit more complexity to the issue, because ultimately that is what's going to serve that social justice impulse, I think.
That makes complete sense to me. There needs to be an appreciation of some kind of like real difference between genders. We don't know what that is exactly. I think we've honed down pretty well into, the masculine archetype tends to look at problem solving, sort of on that, the hero's journey kind of level. The
Mm-hmm.
feminine archetype tends to look at the relational community building. How can we solve problems by weaving the web of our communities and the world together more effectively? Men and women can both probably, to different degrees, flip back and forth between those, but we seem to have presets, right? And
Yeah,
that reality, I think, is at the core of what needs to be acknowledged for us to move forward. And then we don't have that rigidity, like you said, where it's like,
yeah,
well, then men are doctors and women are nurses, or, that kind of thing.
yeah,
Like, no, it doesn't have to be that rigid, but the rigor requires reality. Like
yeah.
that's, like,
Yeah, we don't have to be completely gender conforming or deny the reality of these primordial and persistent cross-cultural archetypes too and patterns. And like there is a yin and a yang. There's a difference between masculine and feminine, right? And there are relationships between agency and communion.
yes.
And these things, again, they're very real. We shouldn't be trying to deny any of this. We should be living into it and embodying it. And maybe that is a way of closing too, just of one way that you've described your journey is as um, sort of embodying this aspirational mode of like, really like, what does it mean to be a woman? And embodying that in an aspirational way. Is there anything that you'd want to share about that? I just feel like that was the sort of next step in that thought.
Yeah, that's where all this like ritual and community support is pointing toward, right? That we can become the way I think about it, better individuals in a culture, not just for the individual and not just for the culture. So I'm not just like, doing it for myself, making myself happy, because so much of my meaning is woven into how do I belong in the world, and authenticity, from like a certain point of view is not me projecting something, but having the greatest, truest relationship, between like for instance, myself and the world.
Mm.
And so I want to use that authentic relationship, what really is, in all of its complexity and all of its nuance, to grow into a better version of myself and allow the previous version of myself to sort of dissipate when it has to. Very, very difficult process, like any, like for a spiritual journey, for instance. But there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the real short version for me. It's something that's been
Yeah.
on my mind a lot lately, is that we're not just individuals, we're not just a group, but to sit in that, the tonos, as John Vervaeke would call it, the
Mm.
dynamic tension between those two, and allow that tension to give us creativity and the freedom to act in ways that are unique to ourselves, but speak to the culture as well.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you. That really resonates for me as well. And I think again, it's what we want for everyone, right? Like every child, every young person, every adult, we're all ideally on some aspirational journey of learning and growth.
Yeah.
And again, the more clarity we can bring to that developmental journey too, the more we can help
Mm-hmm.
people
Mm-hmm.
to self-actualize and to see that, well, if we are reducing things or oversimplifying or getting caught up in certain tight and sort of restrictive, narrow identities, we're actually limiting ourselves and we're limiting our own growth. And
Yes.
that's also not serving our culture and community either.
Yes. And like looking at that objectively to an extent is important. Like, both like, okay, how do I feel? Do I feel better in this role? Does it seem to fit better? But can I, in my own like softly objective way,
Mm.
assess whether my life is better in this new role or not? And of
Yeah.
course, there are going to be, like outer issues like oppression and stuff that'll make it hard to tell exactly. But in a caring community, which we want to develop, we could be able to say, oh, this actually, I am a more effective person now, I'm friendlier, I'm not drinking as much, that kind of thing. And
Mm.
then to have other people be able to reflect back on us and say like, oh, I've noticed that, you seem happier, you are getting more done, you can see, more opportunities are coming to you in life now, that kind of thing. I think that's important when it comes to thinking about like as a, I'm not a parent, but a parent or educator, someone of that nature, to
Mhm.
kind of to look and say, okay, is this working for this person? When they take these little steps toward this direction, how is that? Are they becoming angry and fragile and bitter? Like what's going, are they getting lost in something, or do they seem to be flourishing as a
Yeah.
result?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Rachel, I really hope that more and more people, and especially young people, can start to explore some of these things in some of the ways that we've shared today. I really think it can be helpful for people.
Yeah.
I guess we can close. We're coming up on an hour. Is there anything you'd want to share as a final thought? I know you're working on a book
Yeah.
that is, I think, related to gender. Is there anything you want to share as a final thought or related to that?
Sure. Yeah. I'm writing the book that I would have wanted, that includes the perspectives we've been talking about, especially the aspirational journey, because I think gender can be for people one of many ways to try to approach wisdom in their life, and aspiring within gender can lead us to aspire in other directions as well. It kind of can, pick up the momentum. So for me, the whole full circle process was I'm all about, my gender identity and exploration. I'm looking for who I am, and I'm aspiring to become this person in a, long journey. But then that aspiration now comes back, and now I want to get back into my martial arts or my music and start and, revivify those pursuits, because this is what I'm doing. It's life.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what
Well,
the book is about.
yeah, awesome. Well, the underlying reason I wanted to have this conversation is because this is the conversation that I want to hear, right? It's like I feel like of all the things that I've read and listened to, I didn't quite hear anyone tying it all together. So I wanted us to try to do that. And I think we did a pretty good job. and it's in that same spirit as your book. I don't feel like I've quite had that book that really holds the journey that you're exploring. So I'm so glad that you're going to write it, and then I can share it with people.
Thank you, Brad. Yeah,
Yeah.
this has been a really great, we're always on the we're always kind of floundering in the darkness when it comes to gender, but I feel like we're floundering successfully at least.
Yeah, it certainly seems like you are and we are as best as we can. Well,
That's
thank you, Rachel. It's really been a pleasure, and I hope we can still be in touch. And if there's anything I can do to serve your journey and your writing, let me know.
I will be in touch.
Bye.
Yeah.